Good morning. This is Mr. Pryor again, here on March 25th, my second classroom. Yesterday was the first one that I did. Today is the second, and it's entitled, What Can You Do to Lift Up and Draw People Closer to Jesus During the Midst of This Crisis? In my devotion today that I was reading from the Oswald Chambers devotion of My Utmost for His Highest, here's the first paragraph of it. Goodness and purity should never be traits that draw attention to themselves, but should simply be magnets that draw people to Jesus Christ. I had to ask myself after yesterday's post, am I being a magnet to draw people to Jesus Christ, or am I just doing this for myself? Here's the rest of this paragraph. If my holiness is not drawing others to Him, it is not the right kind of holiness. Sometimes I don't have the right kind of holiness. Sometimes I do things just for myself. I need to do more things for Him. It is only an influence which awakens undue emotions and evil desires in people and diverts them from heading in the right direction. See, if I'm just doing things for myself here on Facebook, then I'm diverting you from going in the right direction. A person who is a beautiful saint can be a hindrance in leading people to the Lord by presenting only what Christ has done for him, instead of presenting Jesus Christ Himself. Others will be left with this thought, oh, what a fine person that man is. That is not being a true friend of the bridegroom who is Jesus. In that way, I am increasing all the time. He is not. And yesterday's scripture I was talking about was, and the lesson from Oswald Chambers was, I must decrease for Him to increase. Now, what can I do? What can you do to bring attention not to yourself but to Jesus during the midst of this crisis? We have to think about that and pray about that. Yesterday I talked about how Sandy Adams on the Through the Word app was talking about Exodus 28-29, and I looked at chapter 30 and 31 today. That was when God was started bestowing gifts of knowledge and skills onto the Israelites. The first gifts that I talked about yesterday was the gifts of needlework, and that was to make garments for Aaron so that Aaron could serve God. And today I was reading about how there were gemstone cutters that God gave the gifts of knowledge and wisdom to do that. God gave the gifts of knowledge and wisdom of being engineers and craftsmen to those people. But what were they to make? They were to make things to the glory of God, and that's what they did. They made altars. They made the ark. They burnt incense. They made incense. He gave them the gifts of skills and knowledge, and that's what God is doing right now in the midst of this crisis. He's giving gifts of skills and knowledge to people to help solve this crisis. And guess what? Some of those people may not be Christians. Some of them may not be Christians. We have to watch ourselves that we're not lifting ourselves up in this, and that we are lifting up Jesus Christ in this. We had a phone call yesterday, and it was from a friend of mine. His son, God had spoken to his son, I am sure of it. His son has gifts that God has bestowed on him of being an engineer and a craftsman. He has a 3D printer. And guess what God got him to do? He is making face shields for this hospital out here. God gave him the gifts of knowledge to do that. He's not doing it for himself. That boy is not doing it to glorify himself. He's doing it to glorify God and Jesus, and to lift up Jesus in the midst of this crisis. And He brought those samples here for Kathy to see. She took them to the hospital today to see if they needed to be adapted in any way, to see if they could be used. People are doing this with the testing kits and the drugs, all sorts of things. And all of us can do things here from our own homes. All of us can pray. There is a church denomination that today wants us all to pray for God to rid us of this COVID-19. And that at noon today, wherever it is at noon today, wherever you're at, that you say the Lord's Prayer. And you just keep saying the Lord's Prayer. Well, what can we do to find out what we need to do? Here's what I pray every day. You don't have to say this prayer, but here is what I